So this is a short, quick summary of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis occurs in 3 stages: photosystem 2, which you see here, photosystem 1, which you see here, and then the Calvin cycle, which is not pictured on this slide. So what comes into photosystem 2, which is the first one? You get sunlight energy that hits a chlorophyll molecule, the antenna complexes, which excites an electron. You also have water that comes in photosystem 2. So water gets split, the oxygen is released as atmospheric oxygen, like the oxygen we breathe. It's a byproduct that the plant cell does not use. The hydrogen gets the electrons pulled off, so these electrons get pushed into an electron transport chain. So these hydrogens getting pulled from the water sit here inside the thylakoid space, creating a concentration gradient. And then the energy from this electron is used to pump even more hydrogens across the membrane so that you can have a concentration gradient. So what comes into photosystem 2 is sunlight and water. What leaves is oxygen, electrons moving through electron transport chain, and a proton gradient. So right here starts photosystem 1 because the electron gets recharged again by sunlight, passed through another electron transport chain. This proton gradient is used to allow the protons to diffuse across the membrane through this molecule called ATP synthase. And ATP synthase, as the protons pass through, spins and creates ATP from ADP. So what goes into photosystem 2, or photosystem 1, are these protons building up a gradient, sunlight again, and the electrons. These things both came from water. What leaves photosystem 1 is the NADP. It's picked up these protons and electrons, changes to NADPH and ATP. So you have NADPH, which is an energy-carrying molecule, and ATP. Those are the two things that are leaving photosystem 1 and going into the Calvin cycle. The third part of photosynthesis is the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle also takes place in the chloroplast, but it takes place in the stroma. The light reactions, which is showing you here, photosystem 2 and photosystem 1, those happen in the thylakoids. So in the thylakoid space and across the thylakoid membranes. The Calvin cycle happens in the stroma, which is the space in the chloroplast outside of the thylakoid discs. So from a really top-level understanding, what comes into the Calvin cycle is NADPH and ATP, which are coming from photosystem 1. Those are energy molecules to help drive the reactions. Carbon dioxide comes into the Calvin cycle, and something called carbon fixation happens. Plants take atmospheric carbon dioxide and fix it into a form that we can use. So ultimately, what comes out of the Calvin cycle is glucose. So the carbon from the carbon dioxide gets fixed into this 6-carbon molecule, glucose. Some details that you might want to look at. So if you see a picture of this, that you would recognize that it's the Calvin cycle versus some of the other chemical cycles that we look at, is the enzyme rubisco. That's really important for the Calvin cycle. Also, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Those are 3-carbon molecules. For every 6 molecules of carbon dioxide that's brought in for carbon fixation, 12 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, or G3P, are produced. Of those, 2 of these 3-carbon molecules join together to form glucose, which is a 6-carbon, and the remaining 10 molecules get processed to yield 6 molecules of ribulose bisphosphate, or RUBP. So rubisco, RUBP, and glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, carbon dioxide coming in and glucose coming out. Those are the characteristics of the Calvin cycle. So now we'll do an overview of cellular respiration. Just like photosynthesis, cellular respiration occurs in 3 primary stages. The first one is glycolysis, which is the breakdown of glucose. This happens outside of the mitochondria. The second stage would be the Krebs cycle, which is where carbon dioxide, which had been fixed in the Calvin cycle of photosynthesis, is now released back into the atmosphere. You have intermediate energy-carrying molecules that are created in the Krebs cycle that then go to the last and third stage, which is oxidative phosphorylation, and that is where oxygen is used to generate ATP. In glycolysis, you get about 2 ATP molecules. The Krebs cycle generates about 2 ATP molecules. And then oxidative phosphorylation produces approximately 34. So you get about 38 molecules of ATP. In eukaryotic cells, it's 32 molecules of ATP from oxidative phosphorylation. So somewhere between 32 and 34. Looking at this in a little more detail, glycolysis is when glucose is split into 2 molecules of pyruvate. So those are really the key words. If you saw a picture and you want to know what chemical reaction am I looking at, you start with a 6-carbon glucose and you end up with 2 3-carbon pyruvates. That's glycolysis. The pyruvate can then go on to cellular respiration, which is going to be the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation, or they have the option of undergoing fermentation, which is an alternative pathway to creating ATP when oxygen is not available. So for yeast and bacteria, carbon dioxide and ethyl alcohol are produced as byproducts from fermentation. In animals, lactic acid is produced, which is what makes your muscle sore when you've worked out really intensely. It's the byproduct of producing ATP and the lack of oxygen. So the Krebs cycle is the second stage of cellular respiration. And if you look at this, you can see pyruvate is entering, carbon dioxide is leaving. You see citric acid, because the Krebs cycle is also known as the citric acid cycle. That's one of the intermediates. But essentially, pyruvate is converted into acetyl-CoA here, which is what releases the carbon dioxide. So if you're looking at the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, you're going to see citric acid, acetyl-CoA, pyruvate. Those are really the key words. What's coming in and what's going out? Pyruvate's coming into the Krebs cycle. Carbon dioxide is leaving. Also, NADH and FADH2 and ATP, you have some intermediate energy-carrying molecules that are going to be going to the last stage. So we're going to end with our overall summary diagram again. The last stage of cellular respiration is oxidative phosphorylation. That is where oxygen is taken in from cellular respiration, and the significant amounts of ATP are produced. About 32 or 34 molecules of ATP are produced in oxidative phosphorylation. That's from every 1 molecule of glucose. In oxidative phosphorylation, oxygen is the final electron receptor, which means that the oxygen coming in is binding with the protons and electrons that have been used in the electron transport chain and in your intermediate energy molecules, and water is produced. So this is where from your cells are releasing carbon dioxide and water that ultimately you're exhaling from your body as carbon dioxide when you breathe out, and water vapor, which you can see on a mirror if you breathe on a mirror. So the products of cellular respiration are carbon dioxide and water. These products become the beginning reactants of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis needs to take in water into photosystem 2 and takes in carbon dioxide in the Calvin cycle. It releases oxygen from the splitting of water, and it releases glucose. And these products then become the reactants for cellular respiration. So we say that they're kind of the opposite of each other if you're writing out the chemical formulas, but the process to get from here or from here to here is not the reverse of each other. But the ultimate end, beginning, and end products are fed into each one of the cycles. So one other thing that I would say here is that there's also an alternative pathway in photosynthesis. There are something called C4 plants. It's called a C4 pathway. Sugarcane and corn are the primary examples of those. That is when plants are trying to minimize water loss, and so there's some modifications regarding the Calvin cycle so that they can keep their stomata closed during hot days and kind of reduce some of their water loss. Those are called C4 plants, sugarcane and corn. And then there's one other type of plants for an alternative here in photosynthesis for producing ATP are called CAM plants, CAM. Those are for water-conserving plants that live in deserts, salt marshes, just other environments where access to water is really, really limited. So examples would be cactus, orchids, and pineapples. So they allow carbon dioxide for the Calvin cycle here to enter their leaves just at night. And these plants fix the carbon dioxide into organic compounds. Then during the day, carbon dioxide gets released and enters the Calvin cycle. So it allows photosynthesis and the Calvin cycle to happen during the day, but also minimizes water loss because they have their stomata open at night. So sunlight, water goes into photosystem 2 of photosynthesis, oxygen leaves, along with the electrons in the electron transport chain, and a proton gradient is created. Then photosystem 1, the electron is re-energized. The protons go through ATP synthase, they diffuse across the membrane, so ATP is produced, and the electrons, through the electron transport chain, produce NADPH. So what's coming into photosystem 1 is your proton gradient and your electrons. What's leaving, you see here, is NADPH and ATP going into the Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle is taking in NADPH and ATP, it's taking in carbon dioxide, and it's producing glucose. That's what's leaving. So when we come over to cellular respiration, glucose is coming in, okay, and glycolysis is broken into 2 molecules of pyruvate, which then feed into the Krebs cycle, or if there's a lack of oxygen, they can go into fermentation. So the Krebs cycle, the second stage, pyruvate is entering and carbon dioxide is leaving as pyruvate gets converted into acetyl-CoA. So pyruvate comes in, carbon dioxide leaves, and about 2 molecules of ATP, as well as some other energy-carrying molecules. Then oxidative phosphorylation, the last stage, you have ATP, FADH2, NADPH that are using energy molecules, and oxygen are coming in, and water, along with a significant amount of ATP, is produced, and that's what's leaving the last stage of cellular respiration.